The day I buried my son, my wife handed me divorce papers. Not at the graveside. Not even that evening, when the last of the mourners had finally filtered out of our house, leaving behind half-eaten casserole dishes and wilting sympathy flowers. It was at 2:47 in the morning when I was sitting at Marcus's old desk, holding a photograph of him at 9 years old, gap-toothed, sunburned, holding up a bass he'd caught at Lake Harmon like it was a trophy fish the size of a whale. She slid the envelope across the desk without a word. I looked up at her. Sandra, 15 years of marriage. The woman I had built everything with, buried everything with, and now, apparently, would lose everything with. "You need to sign those," she said. Her eyes were dry. That's the thing I remember most, how completely dry her eyes were. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 51 years old, a former high school football coach turned regional sales manager, a man who had never once in his life considered himself unlucky. Until the September morning, my 23-year-old son Marcus drove his truck off Route 9 in the rain and didn't survive the impact. What followed was not just grief, it was war. Sandra and I had been struggling for years, quietly, in the way that long marriages sometimes do, not with screaming or violence, but with the slow, suffocating accumulation of distance. We were two people sharing a house, a history, a last name, and very little else. Marcus had been the bridge between us. Not in a burdensome way. He never knew that role had been assigned to him. But in the organic way that children sometimes hold families together simply by existing, by being the shared project that keeps two people pointing in the same direction. When Marcus died, the bridge collapsed. I understood that. What I did not understand, what I could not have anticipated in even my darkest imaginings, was how fast Sandra moved. The divorce papers arrived 31 days after our son's funeral. 31 days. I know the number precisely because I had been counting the days the way a castaway counts sunrises, simply to prove that time was still moving, that I was still in it. The papers were thorough. Her attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Pollard whom I had met exactly once at a charity dinner, had been busy. Sandra was requesting the house, half of my pension, the lake property in Harmon that my father had left me when he died, and sole control of the memorial fund that had been established in Marcus's name by his former teammates and coaches. That last item stopped me cold. The memorial fund. In the weeks after Marcus's death, his former teammates from Crestwood University had organized a fundraiser. They had raised just over $47,000, intended to establish an annual scholarship in Marcus's name for a student athlete from our county. People had donated from 3 states, his old coaches, families who had watched him play. A man in Ohio who had never met Marcus, but had read a newspaper article about the accident and simply wanted to do something good. Sandra wanted sole control of that money. I sat with Daniel Pollard's letter for a long time. Then I did something I had not done since Marcus was 17 and had gotten into serious trouble at school. I called my brother, Ray. Ray Mercer was 2 years younger than me and had spent 30 years becoming one of the better civil litigation attorneys in the state. We had never been the kind of brothers who talked often, but we had always been the kind who showed up. He drove 4 hours from the city that same night and sat across from me at the kitchen table where our mother used to make Sunday dinners, and he read every page of those documents twice. When he finished, he set them down carefully and looked at me. "Daniel," he said, "she's been planning this for a while." I asked him what he meant. He pointed to a clause buried in the property section. Sandra was not simply requesting the lake property. She was requesting it along with a proposed transfer of ownership that had apparently been drafted by Pollard's office nearly 8 weeks earlier, before Marcus died. I felt the floor shift under me. "She started this before we buried our son," I said. Ray nodded slowly. The timeline suggests she may have initiated contact with Pollard's office before the accident. I need to dig into this, but Daniel, you need to understand what you're dealing with." What I was dealing with, as it turned out, was something I never would have uncovered on my own. Ray began pulling threads. He subpoenaed financial records, phone logs, correspondence. He contacted the bank about accounts I had not known existed. He spoke to Sandra's sister, Paula, who, to her credit and at considerable personal cost, told Ray what she had been sitting on for nearly a year. Sandra had not been alone in her planning. His name was Griffin Hale. He was a 44-year-old property developer whom Sandra had met at a professional conference 18 months earlier. The relationship had been ongoing for 14 months. Griffin Hale had, according to Paula's account, been present in our home on multiple occasions when I was traveling for work. He had eaten dinner at my table. He had sat on the porch of my father's lake house. He had met my son. Marcus had met the man his mother was planning to leave his father for and had never said a word to me. I spent several dark nights wondering about that, whether Marcus had known the full picture, whether he'd been protecting me, whether he'd simply been uncertain about what he'd seen. I will never know. That conversation, like so many others, belonged to a future that no longer existed. What I did know, once Ray had assembled the full picture, was that Sandra's legal strategy had been constructed around one central goal: to move quickly enough, while I was submerged in grief, that I would sign whatever was put in front of me before I had the presence of mind to read it carefully. She had nearly succeeded. The hearing that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in February, 6 months after Marcus's accident, in a county courthouse that smelled of old carpet and floor wax. Ray had filed a motion contesting the Memorial Fund claim specifically, arguing that the fund had been established through community donation with the explicit intent of creating an educational scholarship, and that it could not be classified as marital property under any reasonable legal interpretation. He had also filed documentation with the State Attorney General's office, on the grounds that redirecting charitable funds to a private individual potentially constituted fraud. Sandra arrived with Pollard and 2 paralegals. She was composed, carefully dressed, and clearly confident. She had, I later learned, told her sister that morning that she expected it to be over quickly. The judge assigned to our case was a woman named the Honorable Cecilia Marsh, a former public defender who had been on the family court bench for 19 years. I had been warned by Ray that she was nobody's fool and was famously impatient with what she called procedural theater. Pollard opened with a polished argument about Sandra's role as an equal partner in the marriage, her contribution to the household over 15 years, and her right to equitable distribution of shared assets. He was smooth and practiced, and I watched the judge's face carefully as he spoke. Her expression did not change. Then Ray stood up. He did not use notes. He began with the Memorial Fund. He laid out, document by document, the timeline of donations, the stated purpose of the fundraiser, the correspondence between the organizing committee and both Sandra and me. And then, with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, he presented the evidence that Sandra had attempted to open a separate personal account in the weeks following Marcus's funeral, into which the Memorial Fund was to have been transferred pending the divorce settlement. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Marsh looked up from the documents Ray had submitted. She looked at Sandra for a long moment. Then she looked at Pollard. "Counselor," she said, "I'd like you to explain to me, in plain language, how your client characterizes a charitable fund established in the name of her deceased child as marital property subject to equitable distribution." Pollard began to speak. Judge Marsh held up one finger and he stopped. "In plain language," she repeated. What came next was not a dramatic courtroom explosion. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more devastating. Pollard attempted to reframe, to redirect, to introduce language about Sandra's emotional investment in Marcus's legacy and her role as his mother. Judge Marsh listened without expression. When he finished, She made 2 notations on the documents in front of her, removed her reading glasses, and spoke directly to Sandra for the first time. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I have been on this bench for a long time. I have presided over divorces filed under circumstances that would make most people lose their faith in humanity. I want to be very direct with you today because I think directness is what this moment requires." The courtroom held its breath. The memorial fund is not marital property. It will not be treated as such in any proceeding in my courtroom. I am referring the account transfer documentation to the Attorney General's office, which I understand has already been put on notice by opposing counsel. If I find, at any subsequent hearing, that there has been any further attempt to access or redirect those funds, I will hold you personally in contempt. She paused. Beyond that, I am ordering a full forensic accounting of all accounts, assets, and transactions initiated in the 12 months prior to the filing of this divorce petition. Given the timeline discrepancies in the documentation before me, I want to be satisfied that there are no other irregularities. Pollard was very still. Sandra turned to look at me for the first time since we had entered the courtroom. Her expression was not what I expected. It was not anger or defiance. It was something that looked, strangely, almost like relief, as if some unbearable tension had finally been cut loose. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. Whatever I felt in that moment, it was not victory. My son was still gone. The marriage was still over. Nothing that happened in that courtroom brought Marcus back or made the weight in my chest any lighter. But something had been protected. The $47,000 that Marcus's teammates and coaches and strangers in 3 states had given in his name, that would go where they had intended it to go. A kid from our county, some future 18-year-old with a dream and a talent and a need, would go to college because of Marcus. That was real. That was something. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Sandra received a fair settlement, not the one Pollard had originally drafted, but a fair one, the kind that reflected 15 years of genuine partnership without the embellishments that had been engineered in those dark early weeks of my grief. The lake property remained mine. My pension remained whole. Griffin Hale, as far as I know, is still developing properties somewhere. I have made my peace with not knowing more than that. The first Marcus Mercer Scholarship was awarded the following spring. The recipient was a 17-year-old linebacker from Crestwood County named Tobias Webb, the son of a single mother who worked double shifts at the hospital. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional young man. His coach described him as the kind of kid who made the whole team better simply by showing up every day. I attended the ceremony alone. Ray offered to come, and I told him I needed to do this one by myself. They called my name to present the award. I walked to the front of the gymnasium, the same gymnasium where Marcus had played his first varsity game at 14, where I had sat in those same bleachers and watched him, and felt the specific, unrepeatable pride of a father watching his son become himself. Tobias Webb shook my hand with both of his. He had his mother's eyes and his own quiet confidence, and he said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to make him proud." I believed him. I stood there in the gym with Marcus's photograph on the banner behind me and Tobias Webb's hand in mine, and I thought about something my son had said to me once, during a long drive back from a fishing trip, somewhere on the dark stretch of highway before the Route 9 turnoff. He had been maybe 19. We had been talking about legacy in the vague, philosophical way you do at 19, when you're young enough to believe that legacy is something you choose, something you design and execute. "Dad," he said, "I just want to matter to people, not famous, just matter." I held on to Tobias Webb's hand a beat longer than protocol required. Then I let go, walked back to my seat, and for the first time in nearly a year, I cried not from grief, but from the staggering, unexpected mercy of knowing that my son had gotten exactly what he asked for. He mattered. He still does. For every parent who has been asked to keep moving when all they want is to stop, keep moving. Not because the pain ends, but because sometimes on the other side of the worst thing, there is still something worth protecting.